Welcome to Blisters, I'm Oscar the Saxon, and a special welcome to ShamandyShoeFly. I hope I'm pronouncing that name correctly, and my sincere apology, this video is way over a year too late. I asked you, Shamandy, to give me a topic to talk about. You gave me 3. Native American archery or Japanese archery, since these are 2 topics that I've never touched. For a very good reason, I've basically got no knowledge here. Third possibility, I could talk about my favourite fantasy author, and I thought, let's take that as going to be easy. And it turned out it is anything but easy. Now, this will come as a great shock to a lot of you. Yes, I can read, okay? So I tried last year multiple times to make this video, and I found that it is very difficult for me to work out who is my favourite fantasy author. Well, actually, that question is extremely easy to answer. It's my youngest daughter. None of you will know that my now 24-year-old daughter is an author of fantasy novels. 8 years ago, she printed her first book, and as her father, I'm obliged to read it, and with your own children, I feel that you're more critical than you should be. And I was shocked how good the book was. There are 2 things where I thought, that's not how things work, and I read the book, was amazed how really good it was, and came up to some, there are 2 things I'd like to point out, and say, yeah, Dad, irrelevant, I'm scrapping the whole thing. Now, you have not read this book for the simple reason she had it printed 8 years ago, not published. She has not published a single book so far. She has, as she said, scrapped the original book, which she made for a friend for her birthday, you see. And she has created, or is creating, a series of 19, 20 books, something like that. The first is going to be published in 2024, possibly 2025. It's still in the process of being created. What I've seen, I'm amazed how really good that is. But she's not published anything, so I cannot count her as my favourite fantasy author. Different story with Kat Gordon. Kat has published books, yes. Now here too you can say I am biased because I have literally known Kat all her life. I wasn't there for her birth, but I knew her mother long before Kat was born. So I am biased, but once again, I know her, okay, I've got this moral obligation to buy her book. I read it, her first book, The Artificial Anatomy of Parks. I still don't like that title, but the book, I was surprised how great it was. Her second book, The Hunters, even better. This is one of those books where you're coming to the end, or I'm coming to the end, and I don't want it to end. It is so great, I'm so involved, I want it to go on. And it ends, and it was just great. Now, you can't have this book. Not just, it's mine, you hear? No, it's not called The Hunters. It's been renamed to An Unsuitable Woman, which is a much better title. Here, however, the problem is not fantasy. Fictional characters in there. Those people never existed. But the people they interact with are real historical people. The events are not fantasy. So, as much as I love Kat, I can't declare her to be my favourite fantasy author. Now, taking people aside that I know personally, who is my favourite author? Well, if you look over here, you'll see that Bernard Cornwell has a prominent place amongst my books. In actual fact, in the last 25 years, most books, novels that I've read have been by Bernard Cornwell. Once again, we have the problem. This is historical fiction. It is not fantasy. Yes, we have Merlin using magic here. There is talk of dragons and nymphs and things like that, but I wouldn't really classify this as fantasy. And I love his Saxon Chronicles anyway, even better than the Warlord Chronicles here, and they don't fall into the realm of fantasy. So even though, thank you Bernard Cornwell for over 25 years of fantastic entertainment, I can't count you as my favourite fantasy author. Now at this point I'd like to bring in an honourable mention. Michael Reeves, not the deceased British filmmaker, but the American script writer. He's also a novelist, and I do believe that some of his books are actually fantasy, if not just simply science fiction, but I've never read any of those. However, Michael Reeves wrote a lot of TV episodes of cartoon series like the cartoon Dungeons and Dragons that I enjoyed as a child. The best episodes written by Michael Reeves. So here, he has not written novels that I've read, but he wrote shows that I watched, and as I just said, the best ones. Dungeons and Dragons, He-Man, a few fantasy things. I say, yep, great guy. Honourable mention. Now, coming back to the beginning, I actually had over 200 takes of trying to make this video last year, 2020, not 21, right? And I just couldn't get it done. I just couldn't get it done to my satisfaction. And this is why I am doing something here and now that is absolutely unique and you have never done before. So, getting to actual fantasy authors. You cannot live in my world and not be aware of H.P. Lovecraft and the great old ones, Cthulhu. However, I have never actually read anything of his, and I'm not inclined to. It doesn't grab me somehow. So I know he's a great author, or no, what he created has had an impact on my life to a certain extent, not too much as others who are going to be named, but I've never read anything of his and I'm probably not going to. Next, C.S. Lewis, the Chronicles of Narnia. I do believe he also wrote other things, I'm not aware of them. Of his, 7 books, I think I might have read 5. The Witch in the Wardrobe, obviously, Prince Caspian, The Magician's Nephew, The Horse and His Boy, and then there's something else that I can't think of right now. The Horse and His Boy, whichever round it is the one I actually enjoyed the most. The rest of them, yeah, they're nice, but they're not as special, I find, as a lot of people make them. Oh, they're so full of fantasy creatures. No, he just simply took creatures from all across various mythologies and bunged them in there, and wow. No, it's good to read, it's entertaining, it's not fantastic in that sense. So even though I have enjoyed him, not until I was way in my 20s though, okay? I'm talking about the books, not film adaptations. I've seen the very first film that they brought out only just a few years ago. His works were adopted for film last century, and I might have seen that, but nothing spectacular in my point of view. Robert E. Howard, okay, the creator of Conan the Barbarian, so I am going to say Conan, not Conan, right? Conan the Barbarian. Also of kind of the Conqueror and other characters, but Conan the Barbarian is one of those who has a huge impact, has had a huge impact on my life. And I've read probably most of the more short stories and novels that Howard wrote. Problem here is a lot of them, you read them and then you look at the cover and say, oh no, inspired by, and this was written by someone else. So it's hard to tell it apart. And originally I was introduced to Conan by an Austrian called Arnold Schwarzenegger. That's not Schwarzenegger, it's Schwarzenegger. Okay, so it was the 82 or 86? 1982 film, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Conan the Barbarian. And I just loved the character he portrayed, which is not identical to what Howard had created. I come to really enjoy his stories later in life, especially the last year, but actually I cannot classify Howard as my favourite fantasy author because it is more this character that he created than what he wrote. And it is also the character displayed in a way that was not the original intention of Howard. But thank you anyway for creating something important in my life. Only this year I stumbled across something. I thought, now I didn't get a physical book, this was on Audible. I thought I'd stumbled across some fan fiction of The Witcher. Never played the game, but obviously I'm aware of them. Never seen the Netflix series, but I'm aware of that too. I came across this story and it wasn't bad, and I looked up a few other books, and after I listened to 3 of them or so, I actually researched and found out, I thought this was some Polish guy who'd written some fan fiction. No, that was original from the 90s, and they made a game out of that and then a Netflix series out of that. I'm saying Netflix because I think it's on Netflix, I might be wrong, sorry if I am. I've not really seen much of the game, so I can't judge that. There are a few things in the sword play I've seen on the show where I said, nah, pity, but then there are 1 or 2 things I thought, oh, that's good. As far as the stories go, they're not bad, but they seriously do not deserve the hype. Originally, I'm sorry I've not made a note of this guy, the Polish author. He originally just created a little bundle of short stories, right? And they're pretty good. They're pretty good. Then the longer story he fleshes out, the further it goes, the worse it gets. I'm sorry. And I should put him in again as an honourable mention. No. So he is a fantasy author, so he deserves a spot, but he is not really on the list of my favourites. I did enjoy listening to the stories though, the first ones definitely. The last ones I said not so much. Well, definitely a fantasy author is Mr. Shad M. Brooks. M, as you will know, stands for matriculations. If you're one of the 3 people who's watching this video, there's a huge chance that you know Shadiversity, the channel anyway. And once again, I knew Shad long before the book came out. He started writing it long before I was introduced to Shad. And I thought, well, I enjoy his channel. There's a sort of moral obligation to read his book. Fantastic, literally, book. It's really good. It's great. There are 1 or 2 things I think, well, he's sort of overdoing it a little bit, but really enjoyable. I'm still looking forward to the next book, but we'll have to wait. From the point of view of a fencer, there are some really nice things in here, which Shad, as a fencer, deliberately put in for that audience. So thank you, Shad. I don't think you're going to be watching this, but I'm thanking you here. Great book, Shadow of the Conqueror. That's it. 1 book so far, so I can't classify Shad as my favourite fantasy author if so far I've only had 1 book. Seriously, if you do not know Shadiversity, check out the YouTube channel, and I would recommend you look at his Fantasy Realm, where he looks into great topics like what would dwarves really use as weapons, that is. I was familiar with the works of George R.R. Martin before the pandemic, but it wasn't until last year that I started reading the books. Up until then, I had seen the films. I call them films. I know they're miniseries. I call them films, sorry. Really enjoyed them. They're good. The books are even better because the scope is higher, more realistic than it already is in the films. Well, actually, the books point out to me where the films are too small. That aside, really good. And here, I think it's 5 books so far that have been published. Even though they're multiple books, I would say it's just this series. Can I really classify him as my favourite fantasy author? I could. Anyway, so I'm talking about A Song of Fire and Ice, which is commonly referred to as Game of Thrones. I love the TV series. As I just said, the books are great. He's created something really good. He's put a lot of work in it. It's still ongoing, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the series. I do believe he has written other things. Somehow I'm not too interested in reading that though. I'm sorry. This does all boil down into the end that I don't really read much fantasy. I don't really read a lot of novels. Most of the books I really enjoy to read are biographies and books about certain topics that I'm interested in. A lot of that can be history, yes. Actually, quite a few of the first books I read as a child, besides Robin Hood, were about biology and history, my favourite topics as a child, besides stories like Robin Hood and cowboys and Indians. So, obviously, oh, whoops, sorry, what's this doing here? The Richest Man in Babylon. That's not a fantasy story, is it? Well, it is in a sense because it is pure fiction. However, this has nothing to do with the topic here today, but this is the best book that you could ever read. The Richest Man in Babylon, and I never can remember George S. Clason. You want to read this book if you haven't done so. So, who is my favourite fantasy author? Well, I think it's quite obvious, you should have guessed by now, that it is none other than J.R.R. Tolkien. My very first thought when I tried to do this video was, wow, it's Bernard Cornwell, obviously, and then I had to realise he doesn't write fantasy. Once again, as with Shad, my daughter, and George Martin, actually it's not as if I've read 20 different stories. It's not just Lord of the Rings. I was introduced to The Hobbit. My mother read it to me when I was so small. I was under 4 years old. It's before I left England. My father had maps of Middle-earth in his study when we lived in England, and that was, I can't describe what it was. His study was this sort of mysterious room, books all over it. It's always sort of dim lit, and there was sort of, you'd have light coming in through the window and you could see the dust in the air. What's this got to do with books and fantasy, you're asking? There's just something mysterious about this room. And obviously, besides all his work stuff, he also had practically every book that Tolkien had written on a shelf. I couldn't read anything, but I looked at the pictures. I actually enjoyed his Snoopy book much more, I must admit. But as I said, my father had maps of Middle-earth there, and this was just so intriguing to me. I loved The Hobbit when my mother read it to me, and when it was reread, and when I was capable of reading. It was a book that I read multiple times. When I was 13, I tried reading this, and it took me ages. It is such a step from The Hobbit to Lord of the Rings. It's, I don't know, like going from riding a tricycle to having to steer a tank or whatever, I don't know. One hell of a book though, and difficult to read, I must admit, but worth reading. There is so much in here and it has formed so much of my life. Thank you very much to Robert E. Howard for creating Conan the Barbarian. Thank you for, sorry I've forgotten your name, who wrote the computer game Rogue, and thank you for whoever created Robin Hood. But J.R.R. Tolkien, thank you very much for writing Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillions. I also read Farmer Giles of Ham, The Adventures of Tom Bombadil, things like Pearl, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. He did a lot of things that have nothing to do with Middle-earth, but his creation of Middle-earth makes him the most important fantasy author that I have read works of, and thus probably also my favourite fantasy author. Exploring who is my favourite fantasy author exploits the topic, I'm afraid. There's not really much more to say. I have said it. I love the figure of Conan the Barbarian displayed by Arnold Schwarzenegger. I love the works of Bernard Cornwell, which are not really fantasy, and Tolkien has most likely had the hugest impact on my life, my way of thinking, seeing things. Other fantasy works that are based on him. He is the grandfather of fantasy, even if Howard was older, for instance, or his creations, or Lovecraft, I do believe, came before him. Others could be mentioned that came before Tolkien, but Tolkien is the important, the king, if you like, not grandfather. So, thank you, ShamandyShoeFly, for inspiring this dreadful experience. My apologies again that it took me so long. I literally had over 200 takes at this video last year due to my perfectionism, you know, not wanting to rely on a piece of paper, which can be simple. Oh dear. So, this is the penultimate video in this year 2021. Thank you, whoever you are, for I don't know what reason you watched this entire video, and I hope you have a super fantastic last few days in this year, or if you're not seeing this until next year anyway, Happy New Year everybody!